It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I hope everyone had a great weekend. I'm Elizabeth Alfano. I want to get right into it. Usually I talk about why I started this show, but I think today's guest, Dr. Erin Gross, really illuminates all the points that I want to make and even more so. Dr. Gross, thank you for being with me.
Good to be here.
So there is so much to talk about. I first came to really know about you. Of course, I'd seen the movie Eating Animals, which you co-wrote the screenplay for. You are a collaborator with author Jonathan Safran Foer. Of course, hopefully I'm saying his last name right, Foer. Of course, he is the author of Eating Animals, and you collaborated deeply with him on that. And I think you continue to collaborate on projects together. I'll also read everyone your resume, just so that people, not your resume, but to give people a sense of your background so we can really dive into it together. You, as I said, have collaborated with Jonathan, and you're also the founder of Farm Forward and Default Veg, which we're going to talk about. But you're an internationally respected expert on animals and religion. And I think that's very interesting. You're a tenured associate professor at the University of San Diego. You've authored 2 scholarly books and numerous articles dealing with animals and food ethics. We'll talk about that today. Both from the religious perspective and the secular perspectives, your critically acclaimed book, The Question of the Animal and Religion, Theoretical Stakes and Practical Implications, has been a very important work. Of course, I should also say you are president of the Society for Jewish Ethics, and you sit on the Faith Advisory of the Humane Society of the United States. So clearly you come to this issue with ethics in mind and animals, but also people. So I want to start with how I recently came to be so fervish about talking to you. And that is your co-authored article in The Guardian of, here it is, folks, we have to wake up. Factory farms are breeding grounds for pandemics. Tell me, what prompted you to write this? And do you feel since writing it a month ago that people are getting the message?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting time, as we all know, in general. And, you know, the way COVID-19 has changed the landscape of how we think about food is pretty profound. So yeah, things have changed in the last month. There's more willingness to kind of recognize that how we eat and our risk for pandemic is really kind of tightly aligned. I mean, in some ways, this is not a new issue for me. This was a significant part of both the Eating Animals book and the film. So the book came out in 2009. A whole chapter of that book deals with the kind of risk of pandemics. We didn't know it was going to take the shape of coronavirus, but this general problem has been kind of looming there in animal ag, since I've been around, really for the last 50 years. And we've seen why it went more, why there's more attention to this now because of everyone experiencing it directly.
Well, I'd love to ask you that. I'm really wondering if, in fact, there is enough attention given to this. So there's a lot of attention, and I do want to talk about it, workers' issues and what it really means to be a farmer. I think people think overalls and Red Barn, and that's really not the case at all. But I haven't seen too much willingness to connect our factory farms to pandemics. I see people connecting some dark alley over in China. They have pandemic issues and things called wet markets, but I don't see people making that connection here. And of course, as you talk about in your article, we must wake up. Factory farms are the breeding grounds for pandemics. The pandemics that currently exist right now, Asian bird flu and swine fever, both started in American factory farms. Is that correct?
That's the best we know. Yeah. I mean, to be clear, we are not making the connection enough. Policy hasn't changed. We still have factory farms. We still subsidize them, with billions of dollars. So we have a long way to go. What I feel like has happened is a certain opening. And you're absolutely correct. Our attention has quickly gone to like China and these things that seem kind of strange and unfamiliar to us. And we've kind of tended to want to blame that for the problem. But, as I said, 11 years ago when Eating Animals came out, this sort of situation was already, anticipated. And we have a kind of opportunity to get serious about policy here. So that's in a sense what I mean about people are listening. But you're correct. We're going to need to keep talking. To make change, to build a kind of will that's actually going to allow us to, affect change on a more level of businesses, level of where the government is putting their support. And that's what we need if we really want to change pandemic risk in a serious way.
Well, so let's talk about this. Why are factory farms the breeding ground for pandemics? I know, but you so accurately and wonderfully display it in the article in The Guardian. So tell people what really makes this a festering point.
Yeah, so infectious diseases in general, just the whole class of things that are infectious, are tied to our relationship with other animals. It's not just other people. Obviously, when we talk about an infectious disease, it's passing between people. But really, if it's passing between people, it's probably also passing between animals. So part of this is just grasping our general health is tied to the health of the system. Now, these superbugs is what we're really worried about, though, not the ones that just make us sick, but the ones that can really kill us. So how do we get one of those? Typically, you have a very deadly virus already out there, but it can't transmit well. So we're not too worried about it. Unless you're sticking your face in something, you're not going to get it. That's what we have with like H5N1. Folks may remember all the news about bird flu a number of years ago. So H5N1 is still very much around. There's no reason to think we aren't going to see a pandemic. It just hasn't happened yet. And that's just in general what the virologists are depicting. So with H5N1, you have a very, very deadly virus, but it doesn't transmit easily. So the question is, what's going to make it more likely for this deadly virus that's out there, but we can't get it very easily, to change so that it becomes airborne, so that it becomes transmissible as easy as the coronavirus or easier? And that's just a matter of mutations. So the name of the game really is stopping viral mutations. So the more animals you have, the more opportunities you have for viral mutation. If those animals are sick so that they're chronically getting exposed to lots of viruses, that's going to increase your risk. And essentially, this is what the factory farm system is: huge numbers of animals with no social distancing at all, often with their immune systems compromised to begin with. So you have simply the perfect kind of situation for that mutation that we want not to happen to occur. Every time we build another farm, we're essentially making it that much more likely.
I want to quote your article. The meat that we eat today overwhelmingly comes from genetically uniform, immunocompromised, and regularly drugged animals lodged by the tens of thousands into buildings or stacked cages. No matter how the meat is labeled, there are recent pandemic threats coming from factory farms, such as influenza viruses H1N1, swine flu, and H5N1. And there's no ambiguity. These things started in America on factory farms. Help me understand with swine fever, which is really raging through China right now. And I think they've had 147 outbreaks. I understand, perhaps you'll correct me if I've got this wrong, 50% of those infected die, but it remains with pigs only at this point. Is that accurate?
I'm not familiar with the H1N1 state right now. I know with H5N1, we were dealing with a 60% death rate. It's got to be high with H1N1 given our risk for it. But my understanding again there is the issue is that virus going to mutate in a way that makes it really dangerous? So H1N1's out there. We've heard about it. We've had these kind of scares. But that we're never kind of done with these viruses, which is a scary thing to say, given what we're facing. They're evolving out there, and it's a matter of them evolving into a farm that's going to be really deadly. So kind of whatever the risk is at any given moment, what we want to do is just lower it. There's going to be times when there's viral outbreaks. There's going to be times when there's not, but we're kind of at risk all the time. Because it's a matter of, how many mutations are we producing these super pathogens, like, the way in which COVID-19 is something we were not prepared to deal with. Our immune systems is what I'm talking about, but we could also get into our social preparedness.
Yes. And we did know about these, as you say. 2009 was eating animals. And long before even 2009, I believe that scientists had been predicting this all along because of the conditions in factory farms. So you have all these sick animals, nose to nose, beak to beak, but also because of the overuse of antibiotics. So these superbugs now are very resistant to what we tried to do to defend ourselves. So this isn't really anything new, as you say, but I don't think people realize, just to put it in a different perspective, reiterate what you're saying, there are about 7 billion people on the planet. We slaughter about 70 to 80, I'm talking land animals only, billion animals every year. 70 plus 77 plus 7 makes 77 billion living, breathing entities on the planet. Only 10% are social distancing. The other 90% are literally living nose to nose, beak to beak. And we have forced that situation. So if we all think it's important for us to social distance, why wouldn't it be important for the other living, breathing things that spread disease to social distance?
Yeah. And historically, that's what farmers did out of good common sense. There's a reason in our minds farms are associated with pasture, with animals spread out, enjoying sunlight, exercising and moving, because that would tend to reduce disease. What we have right now is exactly the opposite, a kind of farm system that keeps animals in some ways as close to death as possible without actually dying. In the poultry industry, I would say it really is that bad. The industries vary. But the poultry industry is very important because influenza, and this is one of the viruses we worry about, but maybe the number one we worry about, has a very special relationship with birds in particular. So sometimes certain animals matter more than others. With influenza viruses, our relationship with birds matter immensely. So the 9 billion chickens in the US, the 50-some billion chickens globally aren't just a risk because farming is a risk. We're farming a type of animal, which we know the kind of influenza we get is tied to the influenza they get, and we're multiplying them, as you were kind of saying, these are genetically uniform immunocompromised animals. It's a ticking time bomb.
And Asian bird flu is already zoonotic, correct?
Yeah, so zoonotic simply means you're dealing with a virus or a bacteria, any kind of infectious agent that passes between humans and animals. And often, we might say that had a kind of origin in an animal passed to human at some point. So all of our kind of ordinary flu is also zoonotic. So we probably have for a long time been getting more flus than we need to because we're simply pumping more flu viruses out there. And it's an interaction between the animals on farms and wild animals, but this is happening constantly. Right. So a flock of wild birds fly over a confined building with, 100,000 let's say there's 50,000 birds in that single building. And a little bit of feces gets in there from a bird flying above that introduces a new viral pathogen. And let's say that viral pathogen is innocent when it lands inside that farm. But now it has a wonderful set of opportunities to keep reproducing itself and experimenting and figuring out how to become something that can get caught by the humans that are periodically interacting with this farm. And that's the kind of situation that we've been in for a long time that scientists have been warning us about. We've got this kind of incubator for viruses. We already know viruses that make us sick, make animals sick. So it's just a bad idea to have sick animals. And it's a bad idea to have more animals than you need if you want to reduce risk for these kinds of things.
And if they were in the wild and they were dropping feces, it would most likely go on land, or they wouldn't happen on each other. So you're saying that in the wild, if there were room and space and air to breathe, et cetera, these things really couldn't fester.
Would be much, much less likely. I mean, the thing, we really are dealing with probabilities. If we eliminated, all of the risk factors, there's still the chance a virus can mutate. It can happen, but it's very unlikely to adopt a kind of form that we really would need to worry about unless we're creating opportunities for it to really evolve. So the difference between, infection that you imagine happening in the wild, I mean, let's even say there's a big flock of birds and that bird gets infected with this protovirus. Still, probably that flock is eventually going to fly away. It's going to dissipate. But this is not what's going to happen on the factory farm. On the factory farm, they're going to clean out part of the shed, but not enough to kill the viruses, and bring in another, set of birds. And this is going to happen again and again. And those birds are also going to be immunocompromised. When we say the kind of perfect, incubator, that word perfect is really doing a lot of work. These viruses could evolve anywhere, but it would be the kind of, it's like if you were worried about, your kid falling into a pool, you're in a lot more risk than if you've got like a 2-foot kiddie pool that's 4x4 than if you're dealing with like an Olympic size swimming pool and it goes right down to 10 feet. And we're essentially creating the greatest kind of risk situation. We're putting ourselves in a situation where we're likely to see the evolution of pathogens, which we cannot handle.
And what we're seeing now is actually good money being thrown after bad. So in this point in time when you're talking about policy change, you're actually seeing bailouts of meat and dairy. And I think there's just been a request for a second round of bailouts. And you're seeing more subsidies happen for this industry, which is actually making us sick. And that's not just from diabetes and heart disease and high cholesterol and high blood pressure, but it's also this feeding ground for pandemics, which is so worrisome and so costly as we're all out of work and no one, the economy's taking a tank, et cetera. So you talk about this in the case of farmed animals, the lack of public understanding has allowed unscrupulous corporations to move policy in exactly the wrong direction. Across the globe, corporations have succeeded in creating policies that use public resources to promote industrial farming. One study, also in The Guardian by the editor of the environmental section, suggests that the public is providing $1 million per minute in global farm subsidies, overwhelmingly used to prop up and expand the current broken model, because the same $1 million in a minute that promotes factory farming also increases pandemic risk. And of course, it goes without saying that these businesses are not at all capitalistic businesses that support themselves. Without these subsidies, they would fall apart because they are, again, a broken model, not just for pandemics, but also economically speaking. They're not self-sustaining.
Yeah, no, you've really put your finger on the issue that we've been funding a system which is dysfunctional at multiple levels. The pandemic risk is the latest and truly is the most frightening and horrifying kind of part of this system, because it can, kill us so quickly, whereas most of the kind of death that the factory farm has been dealing has been kind of coming up on us slowly. And we decide in some ways through those subsidies what kind of system we're going to have. And what we've let happen right now is corporations answer that question. And, the bailouts you pointed to are part of that evidence.
Yes. And I want to show a newspaper article that just came out on yesterday. I was going to say Sunday, of course, the holiday, yesterday, Monday, saying that in this article, it goes on to say many things, mostly that the data still is uncertain about what's coming out of meatpacking plants now as they open, and that the workers are at risk, and that these are, breeding areas, not just for animals, but for people. This is why such high percentages of workers are sick in these meat working plants, but also that the doctors that work, or the health workers that work to monitor the situation, feel afraid to actually keep the companies in check. So they don't push them to keep the data, to keep the numbers coming, to actually truthfully respond as to what percentage of people are sick within the building.
It's an active cover-up. I mean, it really is. In a very straightforward way. I can't tick off as many examples as I would like to right now, but if we look in the media, we have officials ordering people not to report, claiming bogus concerns with privacy. And this happened exactly as the deaths started to rise. Somehow there was no problem with reporting until it started to indicate that basically all of the hotspots, I shouldn't say all, more than half of the hotspots are the result of Trump ordering these slaughterhouses back in operation. And basically, as soon as the data started coming in, instead of taking the data seriously and recognizing we had made a mistake, there's been a systematic effort not to collect the data. So this is not an accident, and it's not a problem to get the data. And you can be certain when there's this kind of resistance to gathering data, I don't think it takes, a genius to figure out. It indicates the problem is not solved and not under control.
And it's intentionally not under control. And I'll say from the consumer standpoint, it's infuriating, because at what point do we rise up and revolt and say, okay, you've taken my tax dollars and you're working them against me. You're poisoning my food source. Why would anyone want to buy meat that is coming from a factory where you have 50% chance, give or take, of the worker handling that food being ill, transmitting that to the food itself, which we're then going to refrigerate to keep potentially the pathogen alive. So this is, horrible use of taxpayer dollars. It keeps us unhealthy and at risk of pandemic, which makes our entire society unhealthy, not just from the health standpoint, but from the economic and quality of life standpoint. We must take control. back of our own lives. So, I tell this to my senators. You must tell this to your senators, because if you are waiting for the White House to care about you, you're going to be waiting a long, long time, my friends. Let's switch over to another great article. New York Times came out a couple days ago with your collaborator. Let me get rid of that banner there. With your collaborator, Jonathan Safran Foer, the end of meat is here. And this came out last week as an opinion in the New York Times. Let me go ahead and quote some of the things that I love take place in this article. I'm going to bring back Erin's face here. Sorry, so many buttons. Okay. So the article, the opinion article, which I love, answers some very direct consumer questions. And that's what we really care about, is consumers voicing their frustration and voting with their dollars and using their voice, because government is not looking out for you. Do we need animal protein? No. Simple answer. We can live longer, healthier lives without it. If we let factory farm systems collapse, won't farmers suffer? Now, this is a tricky one for people to wrap their minds around, but no, they won't. Jonathan goes on to say, the corporations that speak in their name while exploiting them will suffer. There are fewer American farmers today than there were during the Civil War, despite America's population being nearly 11 times greater. This is not an accident, but it's a business model. The ultimate dream of the animal agriculture industrial complex is for the quote unquote farms to be fully automated. Transitioning towards plant-based foods and sustainable farming practices would create more jobs than it would end. And he goes on to say, don't take my word for it. Ask a farmer if they are behind factory farming. It's basically trying to do away with the farmer, and no honest farmer, who, by the way, does not have a red barn, really believes in this kind of corporate widget of destruction that they do to the animals.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really great sources of American resistance to the factory farm has always been traditional farmers. In some ways, the animal rights movement has been more effective at getting this in the media, but that might confuse us as to where the resistance comes from. The factory farm kind of overthrew traditional husbandry. It wasn't an evolution of it, and it certainly wasn't an improvement on it. It was a model that did produce lots of cheap food fast, but the reality is, with technology accelerating the way it has been for the last century, there was going to be improvement whether we went in a factory direction or not in terms of abundance and supply. So I'm not someone who thinks it's obvious that the factory direction is really what produced all this abundance. But what it definitely did was just decimate rural life and destroy what had been built up, really, since the beginning of the country. I mean, it's not like you can have a year living in a new land without farms to produce food. So from the beginning, of America, you have an evolution of a farm system. And then basically about 75 years ago, you have its dismantling. So, in the US today, I'm only aware of a single poultry farmer, even using the kinds of birds that were, ubiquitous in America from its founding until the 1950s, and that started to disappear in the 1970s. So even just who uses the very, genetics in the birds, I'm aware of one farmer left in the United States that does that. So it's really hard for us, I think, to kind of grasp, standing where we do now, how dramatically food production has changed.
Yes. So just to kind of riff on what you're saying, there are, and I don't know the exact number, 20, 30, 40, 50 kinds of chicken. We only factory farm one kind, which ultimately means we've bred out all the other kinds. I'm doing a gross oversimplification here, but there are even black chickens that, I think have black skin, et cetera. I mean, we have many kinds of birds, and basically this mono growing of one kind of bird is to the extinction of the others.
Yeah, you had a system. This was part of what Americans were proud of, that had lots of different regionally suited birds. So imagine how different a bird needs to be to thrive in Southern California, where I live, versus Maine. right? So you had breeds that were indigenous and kind of to the area, indigenous in the sense that they were there long enough to be kind of bred to adapt, not that they've necessarily been there forever. And we essentially threw out that system for what's called hybrid breeding. I can explain, but we have a complicated, weird way of breeding birds now that's essentially by formula. And the only differentials on the bird are changes in, well, how, I want it to take a little longer to get to slaughter weight. And so they order it with a little bit of slowness built into its genetic growth. It's nothing like the system that existed prior to the rise of factory farming.
Yeah, and nothing healthy either for our environment, because you want diversity. You want the diversity of the animals for our own sake, for the environment, for our health, and obviously for the animals. Jonathan poses another question. Can't we work with factory farming corporations to improve the food system? No. Unless you believe that those made powerful through exploitation will voluntarily destroy the vehicles that have granted them spectacular wealth. Factory farming is to actual farming what criminal monopolies are to entrepreneurship. If for a single year, the government removed its $38 billion plus in props and bailouts and required meat and dairy corporations to play by normal capitalist rules, it would destroy them forever. The industry could not survive in the free market. So you talk about non-American farming practices, and now you're talking about non-American business practices.
Yeah, anti-competitive practices. I mean,
That's right.
It's an industry which appears to be efficient because it has externalized all of its costs, and succeeded basically taking advantage of the fact that consumers don't yet really appreciate what's going on. So there is a tremendous amount of humane washing. This is why a line you read earlier about it doesn't really matter what label is on the packaging can be shocking to people, because there's an attempt to do the right thing, but we have a very, very corrupt industry. And so it's difficult to identify an animal product that really would meet your values.
And I want to say that again, because I think it's worth repeating. Something called humane washing. And ultimately what it means is that those labels, which might say humanely raised or humanely certified or approved by a welfare organization, mean nothing. 99.9% of the animals in the food system are factory farmed, meeting no level of requirement of humane treatment.
Most aren't going to have any certification. And then there are certifications that mean nothing. There are some that means something. It just may not be what you think it means. Just as organic means something, just doesn't have anything to do with welfare. So you buy, an animal that is, or you can be sure that the feed it was given, meets organic standards. But that's all you can be sure of. And with the humane label, if it's backed up by a certain kind of third-party auditing thing, you could look and it probably means something. The question is, does it mean what you think it means? And what I'm suggesting is it's not what you think it means.
Right. And what you want it to mean, what you would hope it would mean. And I would argue that this is intentional. That's why in, I believe, 11 states, it could be 13, but I believe it's 11 states have something called ag-gag laws, which is where you are not allowed to film what happens or write about what happens in factory farms behind those closed doors. Because if people knew what was going on in their food system, they wouldn't want it. And there's no truth and transparency. So they intentionally disconnect the consumer from what they're purchasing and then put a happy label on the milk carton.
Yeah. As undercover investigations started to become effective in kind of closing that loop, I talked about basically this kind of situation where people no longer know what's going on the farm. Well, undercover investigations started to show people what's going on. It's really worth spending some time online and searching for undercover investigations and get a sense of what's out there. And so how did companies respond? Not improving practices, but making it harder and threatening more and more, trying to basically make, First Amendment rights removed if you're critiquing agriculture. No other industry has the kind of gall to kind of spit in the face of America so frequently as agribusiness.
And so vehemently, because now we're talking about another non-American practice, which is freedom of speech. And that goes clearly against any rights of freedom of speech. And I'll further that and say it goes against criminal legislation in that any of the things that happen behind closed doors in factory farms, if that happened to your pet, if you executed that on your pet, you'd be going to jail. Without a doubt. So it's a very clear distinction that the rules and the legal system just does not apply to meat and dairy, and that the government is in support of that.
Yeah, there's something called common farming exemptions, CFEs. They have a name for this. And basically it means whenever we've passed a good law that actually did protect animals, we add a common farming exemption, which says as long as the practice is common, it is automatically humane. So no matter what we come up with, if it's instituted by the industry, which by definition means it's multiple entities doing it, it is by definition humane. So we have essentially taken an industry which has no interest in anything except profit. They don't even have an interest in feeding us. And we've given them license to do anything they want to animals. This is really not a good idea if you look at it structurally. And it's why things are so bad and so much worse than most people realize.
Yes, that's right. And it's why we are having trouble taking back control of our own lives. We are literally locked inside our doors at this point in time, and we can't get back control to curtail pandemics because at a federal level, they're ordering these kind of festering institutions to remain open at the demise of the animals, clearly, and at the demise of workers. And no one's revolting about that either. I would have thought that when workers showed themselves to be 50% of a factory to be ill, that unions would start standing up, that people would say, this is not how we want our citizens to be treated. That didn't happen. What do you think about that?
Yeah, not enough. I mean,
not enough.
Some of the plants that were unionized, the unions have been trying to make this, work, but it's an impossible situation. I mean, we're not going to solve the situation in a crisis. What we can do now is build the will to change it. And this is what I think is new about the current moment, is there's not enough people outraged as they should be for the fact that we literally are killing people to produce more meat. It's not a matter of meat totally disappearing from our shelves. It's simply a matter of, will it be, a slightly more pronounced shortage? And for that increase, we are ready to put, people, last time I checked, it was, I want to say 5 dozen workers that had died. But, that number changes daily. And as we, discussed earlier, it's hard to get accurate data now because you have people actively interfering with the reporting of deaths from these places. So that's something which Americans have never seen before. Anyone who knows the industry knows for a long time, workers have been, put at deadly injury. This is an industry which averages 2 lost limbs a week. That's normal. That's been going on for decades. I don't know how long it's been going on. Year after year, that's the number. I shouldn't jump to how long. But basically, we have a situation where exploitation has been normalized in the meat industry. And what coronavirus is doing is letting you see exactly what that looks like. It means if it comes between a, greater supply, a case of a company, more profit, and worker death even, companies choose death.
So companies choose death, but what's frustrating to me is that consumers aren't rising up and saying, I do not accept this. And I'll further that and say, please don't tell me, anyone, that it's essential, because meat is not essential to me. I'm guessing it's not essential to you, Dr. Erin, and it's not essential to anyone who's grown up on rice and beans and many cultures around the world. So this is not essential. And for the companies to be saying we choose death because it works better for our bottom line, and consumers not finding issue with this, it's troublesome to me. So I would just encourage everyone that if you are waiting for someone else to figure out your life for you, it's going to go very poorly for you. Now is the time to take control and take the reins back for your own health and the health of the planet by choosing. You can vote 3 times a day. You don't have to, take a picket sign and go to the corner. You choose 3 times a day. Every time you place your dollars for plant-based items, you're saying no to the mistreatment of workers. You're saying no to further pathogen spread. You're saying no to not having freedom of speech and transparency in factory farms. You're saying no to subsidies. And of course, you're saying no to animal cruelty, but you are saying no to so many things that are core to what it means to be an American. It's angering.
Wow.
So we talk about a solution. As I said, you're the founder of Farm Forward, and something brand new that I want to hear all about, which is default veg. Tell me what you're up to with that.
Yeah, so Default Veg is a program that Farm Forward is working on with another organization called Better Food Foundation. And this, to me, is the most hopeful way to kind of start dietary change at a kind of policy level. With the idea with Default Veg, maybe you can even guess with the title, is simply to switch our default. So if I go and I order a burger and I don't specify, what I get is a plant-based burger. If somebody really needs to ask for something, they really want to get a beef burger, they can ask for it, but it's something you have to take that extra step for. And what we've discovered is when you, for example, with conferences, if you change the default meals to vegetarian, all of a sudden 70 to 80% of the people are happy to have a vegetarian meal. You've done something amazing for climate change. You've done something amazing for reducing pandemic risk, probably done something good for people's health as well. And virtually, no effort kind of going into it, just changing the default. So the campaign is simply to work with institutions to get them to tweak the way they serve food so that we start to make non-animal food the default. And we recognize when we're moving to an animal product, that's probably going to be a more costly thing. We're probably going to want to look at it more. Mm-hmm. It's the sort of thing which requires extra scrutiny. Let's just make the default what we all know is safe and straightforward, that everybody can eat. It seems to not be associated with all these problems, plant-based food.
Yes, so it's the universal meal that works for everybody. And if you wanted something else, then you would ask for it. What I love about this is it doesn't just say that the vegan vegetarian meal is the default meal. It also does the following. It puts all vegetarian options up front in the buffet. So those are the first things. And then it also changes any ratio in any kind of quick serve line or buffet where it's a 3-to-1 ratio. So it's 3-to-1 veggies. And I just don't mean broccoli. That could be a plant-based mac and cheese or whatever. The vegan veggie options are 3-to-1 compared to meat. And I think that little minor switch makes it so easy for people. They don't even have to think or realize, except they're going to feel better later. But otherwise, they probably wouldn't even give it a second thought.
Yeah. This is what we've learned. If you provide amazing food, and I think nobody can deny we've got amazing vegan food out there now.
Yes.
People are ready to eat it. It's that straightforward. We have a lot of bad habits. And, at Farm Forward, at Better Food Foundation, through Default Veg, we're working with institutions. But, you can also look at this at a personal level. You're making a meal. If it has, ground beef in it, well, try one of the plant-based alternatives. You might find you miss absolutely nothing in that particular dish. This is simply what we want to encourage people to do. Change your default, see how it feels. Often a lot of change can happen very painlessly.
Yes, so easily. So I have two quickie questions for you. First of all, who's getting on board with this? Is it corporate lunchrooms, or is it conferences? Who is your target market here, and have they been receptive?
Yeah, so we've been focusing on universities, but it's broader than that. So this Default Veg comes out of work we had been doing with institutions for a number of years to kind of improve their supply chain. And often what we were doing is working with people to try to buy better animal products. So one of the things that happens if you're a food buyer and you're trying to buy better animal products, you realize they're not easy to get a hold of, they're expensive, it's a challenging thing. So you automatically start thinking, well, could I just, find a plant-based alternative to that? And slowly what we realized is we were in the wrong business. Rather than spending our energies helping people just source better products, it was better at simply focusing on having them reduce it overall. So, some of the institutions that have, so the original program, which is called Leadership Circle, just had a lot of traction. And really the Default Veg comes out of that. So it was these institutions who started with wanting to just buy something that was a little bit better than what they were buying, ultimately were the ones kind of naturally coming up with the Default Veg type idea. Harvard University, Harvard Business School was the place that started developing their kind of food plan, and then it went all around. That's one of the groups we've worked with and where we got inspired to move in this direction. So they haven't formally signed up for the Default Veg yet, even though they did some of the Default Veg experimentation in terms of some conferences. So we'll see where it goes.
Well, hats off to Harvard. I love that. So hopefully you'll branch out beyond universities, and I'd love to stay in touch after this interview, see how I can help. I think default veg is just the way to go. It's just a no-brainer for all involved, and you might see these organizations save some money too, and be able to, do some corporate wellness programs around it, and just really help people out and give people back their voice. Ultimately, you want people to feel healthy again and find an avenue for them to express to their leaders that this is the norm, this is the default that they want for themselves. And I think people are trying to find their way right now. And coronavirus has perhaps brought that to the forefront for them. I'm wondering how you feel about perhaps not default veg, but other plant-based companies working with companies like JBS, Cargill, Tyson, these large meat companies, which, right now are putting the workers at risk. But at the same time, they're turning over 5% of their investments to creating plant-based products or new lines of distribution for plant-based products. What do you think about that?
Well, they're smart business people.
Yes.
None of what I've said has suggested these folks don't know how to make money. And yeah, I mean that's what I see happening. If you're really looking carefully at the future, especially if you're in agribusiness and some of the problems, plant-based products look super attractive to invest in, even if it's going to harm your business. That's kind of your hedge. So it's kind of an odd situation. But I think mostly what it tells us is that we've got a more plant-based future coming. Even the folks who maybe have something to lose from it are recognizing I better get in on it.
Yes, absolutely. I think anyone who does the numbers can see that, coronavirus has been very expensive for them. This is just going to happen again. We're not even talking about environmental resources being not accessible in the future as you go from 7 billion people on the planet to 10 billion people, but you're not getting more land and you're not getting more water. So, if you're doing the math for these kind of things, you can see that you need to be moonwalking backwards and getting into a more profitable business and a more sustainable business in terms of your supply chain, but also just withstanding pandemic crises in the future. You need a more sustainable business, and that's plant-based foods. In fact, that's why I do this show, is because I wanted to highlight the people who are guaranteeing us a safer and more secure future, and that's plant-based food. Well, okay, so we've already been at it for a little while, and I guess we're kind of talking about this now, but I'm wondering, as one of the exit questions I always like to ask people, beyond it's going to be a vegan world, if you could be more specific, what do you think your predictions are for the next 3 to 5 years?
Next 3 to 5 years, I think people are going to finally get pissed. This is kind of what we began with. Are we really ready with pandemics to say no to factory farming? And I think we are. We're not there yet, but everybody who pays attention to a little bit of what's going on in the media that is covering this gets furious in a way I haven't seen before. So I am just more hopeful than I've ever been. I mean, it's terrible that we've had to suffer to get there.
Yes.
But it is heartening to see us finally willing to kind of build the will to end this system of factory farming. So I think what we're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years is people getting really pissed about the billions of dollars we're getting to agribusiness, starting to really make very tight the connection between pandemics and flus. And of course, we already had a long discussion about climate change and factory farming and how it aggravates that. So I think we're going to find people saying, wait a second, this is better for climate change. This is going to immediately reduce the risk of pandemics. This is the kind of system we want. And they're going to say no to factory farming. And once there's a critical mass and that infrastructural kind of prop, those billions of dollars that prop up the industrial farm gets taken away, we're going to see something new arise, and it's going to be better.
It's going to be better. So everyone go to their senators and make sure that you are voicing that you do not want un-American business practices to take place. You do not want subsidies to prop up businesses that cannot sustain themselves. And this is an opportunity for the average consumer to take back their health and take back the health of the planet. It's actually a very empowering moment for the consumer who unknowingly lost their power to big agribusiness a long time ago. And you can see that in the pandemic, where everyone from government to large animal agriculture has put the average consumer and their health absolutely last. Not just the worker, although clearly the worker, but also the average consumer. we're all at home without jobs because we're at risk from pandemics, and this could have been stopped a long time ago. And it was well known, and the consumer care wasn't in place. So this is a moment for consumers to stand up. I'm wondering, you've been at this for a while now, as you say. Eating Animals came out in 2009. What do you wish you knew when you were collaborating on Eating Animals that you know now?
It would have been great to know that this pandemic was going to strike right now.
Okay, crystal balls, yeah, being not available.
Honestly, I'm having trouble thinking of something because the case is as clear 10 years ago as it is today against industrial farming. I'm really not sure in some ways the knowledge of what's occurred in the last 10 years would change anything about how I would make the case against industrial farming. It's climate change, it's pandemic risk, it's our health, it's tremendous amounts of suffering. These problems persist.
Yes. But is there anything on a personal level that you've learned along? And if not, that's okay too. I mean, you're learning every day, of course. So maybe one doesn't stand out. But is there anything on a personal level that you wish you knew?
I see how you go. Yeah, the default veg that we talked about, kind of recognizing that, focusing on changing the defaults, not just a little bit less meat, changing the default, maybe not all the way to veganism, but changing the default, that getting people to change their default is a medium that can achieve scale quickly and really be transformative. And that kind of perfect medium of transformation and stability I hadn't thought of before. So yeah, default veg.
Yeah, I just think this is brilliant. I'm so excited about it. I can barely contain myself. I would love to get in an airplane when they say, you can have vegan this or vegan that. And then if you really have to have meat, you have to ask for it. I would love that because I'm so sick of that chicken and steak option that happens in the airplane. I want default veg everywhere.
It's coming. It's
coming. Well, I just want to help you in any way I can. So we're going to stay in touch after this interview for sure. So I wonder for you, if you could take us to the moment in time, if you can remember, that you knew that it all clicked for you, that this was going to be, because you have a doctorate in ethics, I think Jewish cultural ethics and animals. Someone was asking us about what you have studied, and it is that arena. And is there a moment in time that you can remember, might be a while ago now, when you thought, oh, this is what I have to do?
Yeah, there really is one of those moments. It was sophomore year in college. I was actually just kind of evaluating what I was going to do in terms of an internship. And I was, earnest, young 20-something trying to figure out how to do something in the world. And when I looked at the issues I cared about, what was so striking about factory farming is it wasn't just one of the issues that I cared about. Right? This wasn't, it was kind of where all of them intersected. Right. And so when I started to see, okay, if I cared about climate change and I cared about the environment, this was the issue. But if I also cared about the treatment of workers, this is the most abusive industry on the planet. We're seeing that in a new way with COVID-19. But if I change this industry, I'm also directly kind of improving the situation for human beings. When that kind of became clear to me that this is not one issue, this is really how we live. It's eating. Right. It's the most basic thing human beings do. And we've kind of handed it over to corporations, which are doing it in a way that none of us would approve of. So once it kind of clicked for me, this isn't an issue. This is life. It's eating. And factory farming, then it just felt like I had to focus on that. And 20 some years later, I'm still doing it.
I love this because it's so empowering for people that one thing can click off: climate change, better health, better workers' issues, better animal issues, where your ethics and values align. One thing does it all, and you get to do it through eating, your very favorite activity. Like, what could be more fun than eating your way to a healthier planet? It's just so beautiful. If you're ever having a bad day, and during coronavirus, a bunch of people have had a string of them, is there a phrase that you say to yourself to get yourself back in the game? I like to say, nose to the grindstone, eyes to the sky.
So as someone who tends to be more of a workaholic, I tend to say, you're doing exactly what you need to be doing. Of course, that's when I'm working, to fight factory farming, because this is overwhelming and challenging stuff.
Yes.
And, keeping oneself steady and calm, building that will to transform things. You're doing the right thing if you're learning to end factory farming.
You are doing the right thing. Maybe we could expand on that a little bit, because we talk about this as if, we've got our capes and we're changing the world, but this is a well-heeled, well-funded, well-supported, massive, um, in every ounce of government kind of industry. What hope do you have for breaking through, and what kind of resistance have you seen?
Yeah, no, the resistance is tremendous. I mean,
Mm.
this is the most fundamental form of production. In some ways, we have such a complicated world, we forget that like food isn't like everything else we consume. The basis of your economy, the basis of consumption is built around an ag system. I go back a century ago, and more than half of America are farmers. I go to India or China today, more than half of people are farmers. So the food system isn't just one system among others. It kind of lays a template for how you do things in lots of different ways.
Mm.
So yeah, it's going to be a big challenge to change this system. The good news is the challenge isn't that we don't know what to do. The challenge isn't that people don't care. It's just that not enough of us have galvanized and taken what we know to be true and required our politicians to take this on and to transform society accordingly. So we really could have a lot of change very quickly, because nobody wants this factory farm system except the corporations. But those corporations that want it are not minor players, right? There's tremendous amount of power that's been built up in this industry going all the way back to the founding of the country. And so it's going to be, decades of work to get it fully back.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in what you've just said. It's not just that this is a colossal industry, but it's wildly corrupt, and it is so incredibly pervasive. And their money and lobbies are in all sorts of society at all different levels of government. But when you say you go around the world and there are farmers everywhere, I do want people to understand we're not talking about farmers in overalls with the red barn, the cartoon image that you have seen. When we talk about farming in the United States, the average farmer is so crippled with debt. They have been squashed by multi-corporation farming. It is not the man or woman connected to the land and the animals. That is an absolute falsehood. And it's really the stuff of children's storybooks. And by the way, if our children knew what we were doing to the animals that they so love and adore, they would not want to be our children. So, on so many levels, this is just pervasive and wrong. But I do want to say that this system of moving to, let's say, default veg is not attacking the small American farmer, how very few of them there are left. This is actually helping them. This is giving them an opportunity for better jobs and a better livelihood, where now they're completely squashed. They are widgets in the system, just like the animals.
What we've found with default veg at an institutional level is if a company commits to go default veg, there's almost immediately a cost savings because meat is expensive. If they don't choose to totally eliminate meat, that's now an opportunity for them. They can look at the remaining animal product and they can say, let's actually do something that's outside of the factory farm system. Let's support, and then they'd have to do some work to find it, and it becomes possible. So as far as I see it, massive reductions in the amount of meat we eat and the possibility for the truly high welfare farmers to get business kind of goes together. What we currently have is really a model that just kind of asks for some kind of humane certified meat or something like this. And that tends to just be, factory farm stuff that's, sometimes raised slightly better, but it's, we're dealing with a horrible thing that's slightly less horrible. It's not going to be the sort of thing you want to show your kids. And if we look at it at that level, that's all we got is like, well, kids, this is a little less horrible than it was before. Whereas if we start to change the default, we also can really attend to if it's important to you to still have animal products to support those farmers that are doing it right and grow that part of the sector.
Yes, I think most people will just end up opting for what is just as tasty, what has just as much protein, which has, much better for you fiber, because meat does not have fiber, and you need fiber for a healthy diet. Of course, we have these long intestinal systems. So something that doesn't have fiber, that's dead meat's just going to sit there for several days, not good for you. I think, as you say, once you have an easy default, people will just choose the easy default. So my very last question for you today, and I thank you for all your work, and Jonathan as well, of course, please send him him my thanks, but for all the work you've done on eating animals and the film Eating Animals, and your article in The Guardian and Jonathan's recent article in the New York Times. Thank you for these works that you both continue to do. If you are busy, and it seems like you work a lot, and you don't have time to sit down for lunch, what is your favorite snack?
What am I snacking on lately these days? Honestly, I'm a terrible snacker.
What?
I forget to snack sometimes. I'm a really good lunch eater though. So
okay,
usually
well,
when I get hungry,
what's your lunch?
I get on DoorDash and I order some native foods. I don't know if you have native foods where you live, but this is one of the vegan chains. So that's my go-to when the hunger hits.
Well, shout out to Native Foods, and for all of those people who have been doing their best to stay open and make ordering on Native Foods possible. We thank you. Dr. Erin Gross, thank you for all you do. I hope that you will come back. We have so much to talk about. Default Veg, everybody. I believe it's defaultveg.com or it's defaultveg.org.
I think we have both.
Okay, Default Veg. Tell everyone you know, next time you go to a conference, you want Default Veg. You walk into that plane and you say, like, I want the vegan option. Just get with the Default Veg program, people. Just make your voice known to your neighbors, to your senators, to your family members. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves right back here in this pandemic situation in not too long from now. Because once we get coronavirus licked, if that ever happens, if we ever get a vaccine, there's another one right around the corner. So let's not make it pandemic season. Let's end this and change how we do things. Dr. Erin Gross, thank you so much. Everybody, I want to thank you as well for watching us. And this is your opportunity to take back your health and the health of the planet. Bye, everybody. Doctor, don't go away. You stay with me. Everybody else, have a great day.